Chapter 2. Respect all people. Be kind to the disadvantaged. Isabella Bird. The old and blind people are entirely supported by their children and receive until their dying day filial reverence and obedience. Isabella Bird, travel writer, visited Japan from Britain in 1878. Began her trip to restore her health and received VIP treatment with everything arranged accordingly. A lady traveler with a resilient and noble mind, that was Isabella Bird. Although she was delicate and petite at 150 centimeters in height, it is said that Isabella's sharp observational eye and her ladylike manner had a powerful charm on people. When Isabella was 23 years old, she began a trip around the world. The change of climate was intended as a form of treatment for her chronic illness. According to Isabella's records, she supposedly felt that Japan had the healing qualities she was seeking to restore her health. One notable thing about Isabella's travels is that she received assistance through widespread coordination, both inside and outside the country. 3 years prior to her trip to Japan, Isabella had published a book of travels called The Hawaiian Archipelago and had established herself as a first-class travel writer. Sir Harry Smith Parkes, the British envoy extraordinary and minister plenipotentiary to Japan at the time, had in mind to record the current affairs of Japan and also to draw the interest of the British people to the country. He made exceptional arrangements for Isabella, who was the most suitable candidate for this task, and provided steadfast support for her travels. Parkes offered the British legation to Isabella to use as her residence, and supported every aspect of her trip planning. He negotiated with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and other offices, and made prior arrangements so that he could obtain cooperation from Japan throughout all parts of the trip. He allowed Isabella to use what we today would call parliamentary privilege, and he supposedly even coordinated where she would visit, whom she would speak with, and from whom she would receive hospitality. In effect, Isabella was given permission for limitless travel. Awed by the kindness and refined manner of the people that remained even after modernization. During her travels to various parts of Japan, Isabella felt the kindness of the people firsthand. In one incident, a leather belt attached to her horse's back went missing. It was getting dark, and Isabella was close to giving up when the horse attendant retraced his steps for 4 kilometers to find and retrieve the belt. Isabella tried to hand him some money for his hard work, but the attendant is said to have firmly refused, saying, "It is merely my responsibility as a horse attendant to deliver the traveler safely to their destination." Isabella was in awe at his exceedingly refined manner and kindness. Isabella also discovered that this refinement and kindness was not limited to adults. When she tried to give sweets to children, the children insisted they could not accept unless they had gotten permission from their parents first. Once they got permission and returned again, they smiled and bowed their heads deeply and thanked Isabella before finally accepting the sweets. Furthermore, instead of eating them right away, they would first offer some to the other children around them, and they themselves would eat last. Isabella later returned to Japan numerous times and traveled through many cities and mountain villages. When she arrived again in 1895, more than 15 years after her first trip, it seems she saw the changes that modernization had brought to Japan's urban areas. However, it is said that she was happy to see that the lifestyles of the people in farming villages had barely changed. Be considerate even to your enemies. Francis Brinkley. I have come to know many stories of revenge. However, I have never known any story like what I have seen before my eyes just now, where one shows kindness after accomplishing revenge. Francis Brinkley, journalist, naval man, nobleman, visited Japan from Ireland through Hong Kong in 1867. Deeply impressed from coincidentally witnessing a duel. What on earth? Francis happened upon an unfamiliar scene unfolding before him, which was to change his life forever afterward. He had witnessed a duel between two samurai. First, one samurai struck down the other and delivered the fatal blow with his sword. The victor then calmly knelt down beside the body and respectfully brought his palms together in prayer. Finding this curious, Francis asked his nearby guide what the samurai was doing. The guide answered, "The samurai who was able to carry out his vengeance successfully is praying to Buddha so that the man he has killed can go to heaven, as you would say in your country, or nirvana, as we would say in Japan." After praying for some time with his hands together, the samurai then picked up the haori coat that the other man had cast off. He dusted it off and gently draped it over the body, and picked some flowers from the roadside and placed them by the body as an offering. The samurai put his hands together and prayed again before leaving, saying that he would report this incident to the government office. Francis, who had witnessed this incident unfold from the beginning to end, was deeply moved. He wondered where else in the world would a man wish a peaceful afterlife for an enemy whom he had killed. Instead of disgracing the dead body or abandoning it, the samurai had dusted off the man's haori and draped it over him, leaving flowers for his soul's repose. For Francis, who had also received military training in Ireland, his amazement was immeasurable. As a journalist, he transmitted information about Japanese culture to countries abroad. Thus Francis fell in love with Bushido, or the way of the warrior, and decided that he wanted to live permanently in Japan. He began his rigorous study of acquiring the Japanese language. A naturally talented writer, Francis acquired the Japan Mail newspaper in 1881 and became its owner and chief editor. He worked diligently at reporting on Japanese culture at the paper. In 1892, he became a correspondent for the London Times and continued to report on the situation in Japan from the First Sino-Japanese War to the Russo-Japanese War with a consistently sympathetic stance. Aside from his journalistic activities, he also wrote sophisticated books that introduced people to Japan. Francis was a man of many interests, and in his fatherland he enjoyed horseback riding, tennis, cricket, and gardening. After coming to Japan, he began pursuing the Japanese tea ceremony. He was also knowledgeable in Japanese art, and when it came to appraising ceramics, his abilities were beyond those of a hobbyist. One could even call him an expert. When he was 37, Francis decided to marry Tanaka Yasuko, the daughter of a feudal retainer of the Mito domain. However, at the time, British law did not recognize marriage between a white person and one of a different race. Extremely angered by this, Francis spent an enormous amount of money to appeal to the British High Court, won the appeal, and was able to marry Yasuko. This became the first precedent to recognize the marriage between a Japanese and a British citizen. Following this, numerous cases began to appear of Englishmen taking Japanese women as wives. Francis made his home in Hiro-cho, Azabu, with his property consisting of a Western house with a Japanese garden. He lived there until his death in 1912. In his writings he says, "I wanted to live according to the warrior ways of Japan." So fascinated he was with Japanese culture. For 45 years since arriving in Japan, he never once returned to his home country. When a dispute occurs, first apologize. Carl Munsinger. I often encounter scenes where rickshaw drivers coming from different directions collide with each other. It is an unpleasant experience, of course. European laborers would likely vent their pain through fighting, or at least by insults or curses. But in Japan, the rickshaw drivers facing each other with bare arms and legs, wearing barely anything apart from their happy coats, are satisfied just to bow gracefully to each other and to ask politely for the other's forgiveness. Carl Munsinger, missionary, visited Japan from Germany in 1889. Mastered the Japanese language and observed the unique behavior of Japanese people with great interest. A shy and honest German missionary, Carl first set foot on Japanese soil when he was just 26 years old. At the time, there were already other missionaries doing work in Japan. Carl, with his reserved personality, took care not to get in the way of his predecessors. He began his missionary work by introducing Germany to Japan, such as teaching German literature to university students and submitting papers to theological journals. Carl had an exceptional talent for language and was fluent in Latin, Greek, and English, in addition to his mother tongue of German. His talent shone in Japanese as well. It is said that he had a near complete command of Japanese by the end of his mere 6-year stay in Japan. Carl used his fluent command of Japanese to its fullest and socialized closely with all manners of people, ranging from high government officials to commoners. At the time, it was still very rare for a foreigner to have a command of Japanese beyond broken speech. Carl was treasured as a precious exception to the norm. Carl had a keen observational eye and excelled at calmly observing and recording situations and people. Whenever he came across behaviors or mannerisms he thought to be unique to Japanese people, it became his habit to think about why they acted this way. For example, when Japanese people visited each other, they wouldn't immediately bring up their purpose of business. When they made speeches, they never went right into the main topic. They first started with mundane daily topics such as the weather or the journey. For each and every case, Carl would contemplate by himself about why this was so, and left his findings in a journal. The words at the beginning of this section are but one example. After leaving Japan against his wishes, he still continued to pursue Japanese culture through his writings. Carl fell ill sometime after his 6th year in Japan, and it was decided that he needed to recuperate in his homeland. With great regret, Carl returned to Germany. Although he strongly wished to return to Japan, it is said that his physician did not allow it until the end. Unable to sever his attachment for Japan, Carl began to write a book, Die Japaner, at a small church in the German countryside. In a quiet room, feeling the breaths of the grapevines planted in the yard, he cast his thoughts to the faraway land of Japan and poured his heart into the book. He attempted to explore the mindset unique to the Japanese, called the Yamato Damashi. During the writing of his book, Carl repeatedly expressed gratitude that he was a missionary. It was thanks to this that he was able to learn the Japanese language and learn Japan's literature and history. He had even gone inside a Japanese house and been able to observe its interior when normally it would have been difficult to just get close. His gratitude for these opportunities seeps through in his writing.